Welcome back to the Science of Ageless Living. I'm your host, Dr. Ethan Hausman-Marquis, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about something that, on the surface, sounds like the opposite of longevity. What happens to your atoms after you die? This might sound like a philosophical detour, but it's really a deep dive into physics, thermodynamics, and what it means to be a temporary pattern in a universe of almost unimaginably durable matter. In this episode you're about to hear, we'll start with Carl Sagan's famous reminder that we are made of star stuff, and then push it one step further. If the nitrogen in your DNA and the calcium in your bones were born in collapsing stars, what actually happens to the star stuff when your biological story ends? When a body is heated to 1,400, 1,800 degrees in a cremation chamber, water flashes off as vapor, carbon becomes carbon dioxide, nitrogen returns to the air, and bone mineral is left behind as a residue of calcium phosphate. None of those atoms are lost. Only the pattern that arranged them into you disappears. So why is this relevant to longevity and aging medicine? Because everything we do in this field, peptides, hormones, mitochondrial support, metabolic tuning, sleep, strength, cognitive protection, is ultimately about preserving a pattern, not hoarding atoms. Your atoms are constantly cycling even while you're alive. Over the span of years, most of the material in your body has been swapped out through food, water, and air. Yet your identity persists because the structure and dynamics of your nervous system, your networks, your feedback loops are still coherent. Aging is what happens when that coherence erodes, when repair can't keep pace with entropy, when the pattern frays faster than you can rebuild it. In other words, longevity science is applied thermodynamics. We're working with the same laws that govern cremation, decomposition, and stellar physics, but we're trying to extend the period during which 7 octillion atoms are arranged in a way that can heal, adapt, learn, connect, and generate meaning. Understanding that your atoms are effectively immortal, while your pattern is not, doesn't make the work of ageless living pointless. It makes it urgent. It reframes the goal, not to fight the inevitability of transformation, but to maximize the quality, clarity, and vitality of the pattern while it exists. In the main body of this episode, we're going to use the physics of cremation as a lens to examine what life actually is at the atomic level, how entropy relates to aging, and why interventions that seem abstract, like improving metabolic flexibility or supporting mitochondrial function, for example, king danchamitrans, doesn't culture, so exes first, geti bor ti, edrori ibjesor. These are ways of buying more time for this extraordinarily unlikely configuration of atoms called you to keep doing its work in the world. There's a quote from Carl Sagan that I've loved since I first heard it. The nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. It's poetic. It's accurate, and it's grounding. Your body isn't separate from the universe. It's not some special substance. It's recycled stellar material, rearranged into a temporary biological pattern that can think, feel, and ask questions about itself. But there's a follow-up question Sagan didn't really answer. If we're made of star stuff, what happens to that star stuff when we die? Specifically, what happens during cremation? When a body is placed into a cremation chamber and heated to roughly 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, we tend to imagine total destruction, obliteration, finality. But that's not what physics says. Not a single atom is destroyed. Not one proton, not one neutron, not one electron disappears in that chamber. Cremation breaks molecular bonds. It dismantles the chemistry that held your tissues together. Water becomes vapor. Carbon becomes carbon dioxide. Nitrogen becomes gas. The mineral structure of bone remains behind. But the atoms themselves, they are unchanged. To actually destroy an atom, to break apart its nucleus, you'd need temperatures found in the cores of stars or in nuclear reactions. Cremation doesn't even come close. So what ends? The pattern ends. You are not your atoms. You are the arrangement of those atoms, the specific, dynamic configuration that produced your consciousness, your memories, your personality. Think of a book. A book isn't paper and ink. It's the pattern of ink on paper. Burn the book and the atoms in the paper and ink remain, rearranged into ash and gas. But the story is gone. Cremation is the same. The structure that was you dissolves. The atoms scatter into the air, into the water cycle, into plants, into soil, into other living systems. They continue their journey through the universe. And there's something both humbling and clarifying about that. You are temporary. Your atoms are not. For a brief window of time, 7 octillion atoms arrange themselves in a way that can reflect on existence. Then that arrangement dissolves and the atoms move on. No annihilation, no cosmic deletion, just transformation. The pattern ends. The star stuff continues. To understand where your atoms go, we first have to understand what you're actually made of, not philosophically, but chemically. The average human body contains on the order of 7 x 1027 atoms, 7 octillion, a 7 with 27 zeros after it. That number is so large, it's almost useless emotionally. But here's the important part. Those atoms are not random. Your body follows a remarkably consistent recipe. About 60 to 65% of your mass is oxygen, not oxygen gas floating around in your lungs, but oxygen atoms bound into water and into organic molecules. Water alone accounts for roughly half to 60% of your body weight. Every cell you have is essentially a bag of structured water with chemistry happening inside it. Around 18% of your mass is carbon. Carbon is the structural backbone of life. It forms long chains and rings, making it uniquely capable of building complex, flexible, stable molecules. Every protein, every fat, every carbohydrate, every strand of DNA in your body is built on carbon scaffolding. About 10% is hydrogen. Again, largely in water, but also attached to carbon in organic compounds. Hydrogen may be the simplest element in the universe, but in your body, it's critical for maintaining pH balance, powering cellular energy systems, and forming the bonds that give molecules their shape. Then there's nitrogen, a few percent by mass, primarily found in proteins and DNA. Nitrogen is what allows amino acids to exist. It's central to the nucleotides that encode your genetic information. Without nitrogen, there is no genetic code, no replication, no inheritance. After that, we move into the structural minerals. Calcium and phosphorus make up most of your skeletal framework. They're arranged in a crystalline structure called calcium phosphate, giving your bones rigidity and strength. Without that mineral lattice, you would collapse under your own weight. Then come the trace elements, present in tiny amounts, but absolutely essential. Sodium and potassium regulate electrical gradients across cell membranes. Every thought you have depends on sodium and potassium moving across neurons. Chlorine helps maintain fluid balance. Magnesium acts as a cofactor in hundreds of enzymatic reactions, including ATP metabolism. Iron sits at the center of hemoglobin molecules, allowing your blood to transport oxygen. Sulfur stabilizes protein structures through disulfide bonds. Tiny amounts, massive impact. Now here's where this becomes interesting. These 7 octillion atoms are not static. They are arranged in a highly specific, constantly changing configuration. Proteins are being built and broken down. DNA is being transcribed. Cells are dividing. Mitochondria are generating ATP. Ions are flowing across membranes. You are not a solid object. You are a controlled chemical storm. And the truly remarkable part is this. That storm is conscious. That arrangement of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, iron, and trace elements can reflect on itself. It can contemplate its own mortality. It can listen to this podcast and ask, what happens when this stops? And here's something even more destabilizing. The atoms in you right now are not the same atoms that were in you years ago. Through breathing, eating, drinking, sweating, shedding skin cells, you are constantly exchanging atoms with your environment. The pattern persists. The atoms cycle through, which means even before death, you are already a temporary configuration in motion. 7 octillion atoms, borrowed from the Earth and the atmosphere, arranged for a few decades into a structure capable of memory, ambition, love, fear, creativity, and curiosity about what it's made of. That's you at the atomic level. not mystical, not separate from the universe, just matter, arranged with extraordinary precision, long enough to become aware of itself. Now let's walk into the cremation chamber, not in a morbid way, but as physicists, chemists, and curious humans. Modern cremation systems typically operate between 11400 and 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 760 to 980 degrees Celsius. That temperature range isn't arbitrary. It has to be hot enough to break down the molecular bonds that hold biological tissue together, but not so extreme that everything, including mineral bone, vaporizes. This is controlled chemistry, not incineration chaos. And here's the critical distinction. At those temperatures, we are nowhere near the energy required to break atoms apart, let alone split atomic nuclei. To disrupt an atomic nucleus, to separate protons and neutrons, you need temperatures found in stellar cores or nuclear explosions. We're talking millions to billions of degrees. A crematorium operates at less than 1,000 degrees Celsius. From a physics standpoint, that's gentle. So what does happen? Cremation breaks molecular bonds, not atoms themselves. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates, DNA, those long carbon-based molecules that make up tissue, begin to decompose under heat. Their chemical bonds destabilize. They fragment. In the presence of oxygen, many of them combust. Carbon bonds with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, hydrogen bonds with oxygen to form water vapor, nitrogen bonds break and form nitrogen gas. These molecules rise as gases and exit through the system's exhaust. But at no point are atoms destroyed. They are simply rearranged. Think of it as dismantling a complex Lego structure. The bricks aren't destroyed. They're just no longer assembled into the same shape. Now let's break it down in stages. First, water leaves. Your body is mostly water. At cremation temperatures, that water rapidly vaporizes. Steam escapes. The hydrogen and oxygen atoms that were part of your blood, your cells, your brain, they're now atmospheric water vapor. Second, organic material decomposes and combusts. The carbon framework of your tissues oxidizes. Carbon becomes CO2. Nitrogen becomes N2. Other small molecules form and dissipate. The complex, highly ordered biochemistry that once sustained consciousness becomes simpler. Lower energy molecules dispersed into the air. This is thermodynamics in action. A living body is a highly ordered system, low entropy. It constantly consumes energy to maintain that order. Cremation accelerates what entropy eventually does to all biological systems. Instead of months or years of microbial decomposition, heat accomplishes the same breakdown in hours. What remains? Mostly mineral bone. Calcium and phosphorus exist in a crystalline lattice, calcium phosphate. That structure is far more thermally stable than organic molecules. So when the organic matrix burns away, the mineral framework persists. After cooling, those remaining bone fragments are processed into what people call ashes. But chemically, they are pulverized mineral residue. Again, no atoms gone, just a different configuration. And here's what matters philosophically and scientifically. The pattern that was you ends in that chamber. The molecular organization that enabled metabolism, memory, personality, that dissolves. But the atoms, unchanged. Same protons, same neutrons, same electrons. They're simply participating in new chemical relationships. And this is the part most people misunderstand. Cremation feels like annihilation. Physics says it's transformation, not poetic transformation, not symbolic transformation, literal molecular rearrangement, matter obeying thermodynamic law. And whether it happens rapidly through heat or slowly through burial and microbial decay, the endpoint is the same. The highly organized biological structure becomes dispersed matter in the broader environment. The atoms are conserved. The structure is not. And that distinction, atoms versus pattern, is the key to understanding what death actually is at a physical level. The first major transformation during cremation is almost entirely about one thing, water. A human body is roughly 60% water by mass. That means more than half of what you physically are is structured fluid in your blood, inside your cells, surrounding your tissues. And water does not linger under heat. At 100 degrees Celsius, water boils. Cremation temperatures are 7 to 9 times higher than that. So as the chamber temperature rises and heat penetrates the body, the water in your blood, organs, muscle tissue, and even within individual cells begins to vaporize rapidly. It doesn't explode. It doesn't chemically disintegrate. It simply changes state. Each water molecule, 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to 1 oxygen atom, H2O, remains chemically intact. We are not splitting water into hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. That would require much higher energies. This is not nuclear physics. This is phase change. Liquid becomes vapor. That vapor, steam, moves through the exhaust system and exits into the atmosphere. And just like that, a massive portion of your physical mass is no longer in the chamber. It's in the air. Now here's where this becomes fascinating. Once in the atmosphere, those water molecules re-enter the hydrological cycle. They can condense into clouds. They can fall as rain. They can seep into soil and groundwater. They can be drawn upward by tree roots, pulled through vascular systems of plants, incorporated into sap and leaves. They can flow into rivers, lakes, and oceans. They can evaporate again. They can be drunk by another human, inhaled into lungs as humidity, frozen into glaciers or polar ice, circulated through entirely new biological systems. After the water leaves, the next major transformation involves something even more central to life: carbon. If water is the medium of biology, carbon is the framework. Your fats, your proteins, your DNA, your carbohydrates, all of them are built on carbon backbones. Long chains, rings, complex, three-dimensional structures with hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen attached. Carbon is what makes organic chemistry possible, and under high heat, that chemistry begins to unravel. Inside the cremation chamber, as temperature and exposure time increase, those organic molecules destabilize, their bonds weaken. In the presence of oxygen, they combust. Carbon atoms bond with oxygen atoms from the air to form carbon dioxide, CO2. In intermediate stages, some carbon monoxide, CO, may form as well before fully oxidizing. Hydrogen atoms in those molecules typically combine with oxygen to form water vapor. Again, nothing is being destroyed. No atoms vanish. Bonds are broken. New bonds are formed. The carbon that made up your DNA, your cell membranes, your myelin sheaths, your triglyceride stores. Within a couple of hours, most of it exists as CO2 drifting upward through the flue and out into the atmosphere. And once it's there, it enters one of the most fundamental planetary systems, Earth's carbon cycle. Plants pull carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis. Using sunlight as an energy source, they convert CO2 into glucose, into cellulose, into lignin, into the structural molecules that build stems, leaves, bark, roots. Some of the carbon that once formed your neurons may become part of a tree trunk. Some may become a blade of grass. Some may become part of a vine, a crop field, a wildflower. From there, animals, including humans, eat those plants. Microbes in soil metabolize plant matter. Carbon moves into new biological systems. Some of that CO2 dissolves into oceans, where it may be taken up by phytoplankton, microscopic organisms that form the base of marine food chains. Some carbon eventually becomes carbonate minerals incorporated into shells, sediments, and geological structures. Over tens, hundreds, thousands of years, the carbon that was once you will be distributed across ecosystems. Atmosphere, forest, soil, ocean, animal, microbe. It keeps moving. And here's something important to understand. This isn't sentimental. This is mechanical. Carbon atoms don't have preference. They don't care what organism they're in. They follow concentration gradients, chemical pathways, thermodynamic rules. They bond and unbond according to physical law. The carbon atoms that once contributed to your thoughts do not retire. They don't sit idle. They don't maintain identity. They simply stop being arranged in the specific pattern that was your body. And that distinction matters because carbon is constantly cycling, even while you're alive. Every breath you exhale contains carbon dioxide that was part of your metabolism moments earlier. Every bite of food you eat contains carbon recently pulled from the air by plants. You are continuously exchanging carbon with the environment. Cremation simply accelerates the redistribution. It takes a highly ordered carbon structure in a living body and rapidly disperses it back into planetary circulation. From a thermodynamic perspective, this is entropy increasing. Organized complexity becomes simpler molecular forms. Structured tissue becomes atmospheric gas, but at the atomic level, the story is continuity. The same carbon atom that sat in your hippocampus could decades later be part of a redwood tree, or a field of wheat, or another human being. Not metaphorically, literally. Carbon does not disappear. It migrates. And once you understand that, cremation stops looking like annihilation and starts looking like redistribution. The pattern ends, the carbon continues its route through forest, ocean, soil, and sky. And in that sense, the material that formed your body doesn't leave the planet. It reintegrates into it. Now let's talk about nitrogen. It doesn't get the poetic attention carbon does, but biologically, it's just as essential. Nitrogen is a core component of amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. It's also embedded in nucleotides, the molecular letters that form DNA and RNA. Without nitrogen, there is no genetic code, no enzymes, no muscle contraction, no antibodies, no replication. If carbon builds the scaffolding of life, nitrogen helps encode and execute its instructions. Inside the cremation chamber, as heat dismantles proteins and DNA, those nitrogen-containing molecules break apart. The complex structures of amino acids and nucleotides unravel, bonds break, atoms separate and recombine. Ultimately, much of that nitrogen is released as nitrogen gas, N2. Depending on oxygen levels and combustion conditions, some nitrogen oxides may form temporarily, but the stable endpoint is overwhelmingly N2. And here's what's almost funny about that. Nitrogen gas already makes up about 78% of the air you're breathing right now. So when your body's nitrogen is released, those atoms aren't entering some exotic state. They're simply rejoining an enormous atmospheric reservoir. From a planetary perspective, it's like pouring a glass of water back into the ocean. But nitrogen gas, N2, is chemically inert under most conditions. It doesn't readily participate in biological reactions. So how does it re-enter life? This is where the nitrogen cycle comes in. Certain bacteria, in soil and in the roots of specific plants like legumes, perform a process called nitrogen fixation. They convert atmospheric N2 into biologically usable forms like ammonia and nitrates. Those compounds are absorbed by plants and incorporated into amino acids and nucleotides. Plants build proteins. Plants build DNA. Then animals eat the plants. The nitrogen moves into animal tissue, muscle, organs, blood, brain. And just like that, nitrogen atoms that were once part of your proteins could become part of another organism's biology. In a very literal sense, nitrogen atoms that once helped encode your traits could someday be incorporated into someone else's DNA, or into the genome of a bacterium, or into the chlorophyll of a leaf, or into the muscle tissue of an animal. They won't carry your memories. They won't carry your personality. They don't store identity. They are not mystical carriers of consciousness. They are atoms. They participate in chemistry. And that chemistry continues. There's something sobering about this. The nitrogen in your genetic code, the atoms that once helped specify eye color, height, metabolic tendencies, does not retire when you do. It re-enters circulation. And this isn't unique to cremation. Even while you're alive, nitrogen cycles through you. You take in dietary protein, you break it down, you excrete nitrogenous waste, you exchange nitrogen with the environment constantly. Life is a temporary pause in that flow. Cremation simply removes the organizational barrier that was holding those nitrogen atoms in a particular configuration. Once that structure collapses, the atoms disperse and return to the atmospheric and biological cycles that have been running for billions of years. From a thermodynamic standpoint, this is just entropy increasing. From a system standpoint, it's redistribution. From a biological standpoint, it's continuity without identity. The pattern that was you dissolves, but the nitrogen the elemental component that once helped encode your existence, continues participating in the chemistry of life. And that distinction is important because it forces us to confront something precise. Matter continues. Information does not. The atoms remain in circulation. The specific arrangement that made them you does not. And nitrogen, quietly cycling through air, soil, plant, animal, and genome, is one of the clearest examples of that truth. Up to this point, we've talked about what leaves. The water becomes vapor. The carbon becomes carbon dioxide. The nitrogen rejoins the atmosphere. But not everything exits the chamber as gas. Some of the atoms in your body are locked into structures that are far more thermally robust. Your bones and teeth are primarily composed of a mineral called hydroxyapatite, a crystalline lattice of calcium and phosphate with carbonate and other ions integrated into the matrix. This is not soft organic chemistry. This is mineral architecture at cremation temperatures 1400 to 1800 degrees Celsius. The organic components of bone, particularly collagen, are burned away. Collagen is protein. Protein decomposes and combats. But the mineral scaffold remains. Hydroxyapatite is stable at those temperatures. To truly vaporize calcium phosphate, you would need significantly higher heat than a crematorium provides. So what you're left with after cremation is not ash in the fireplace sense. It's not fluffy carbon soot. It's dry, brittle fragments of mineral bone. Once the chamber cools, those fragments are collected and mechanically processed into a finer, sand-like powder. That powder is what families receive as cremated remains. From a chemical standpoint, it's largely calcium phosphate, along with trace minerals that were part of your skeletal system. Now here's the perspective shift. For an average adult, those remains typically weigh between 4 and 8 pounds, roughly 3.5 to 4.5% of healthy body weight. So if someone weighed 150 pounds in life, they might leave behind only a few pounds of mineral residue, which means over 90% of their mass has already dispersed into the atmosphere as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen gas. When people imagine cremation, they often picture a body reduced to ash. In reality, most of the body has already transitioned into gas. What remains is the densest, most structurally resilient portion, the mineral framework that once supported muscle, organ, and posture. And even that isn't permanent. Those bone minerals are ancient. The calcium in your skeleton was forged in stellar processes billions of years ago. It cycled through rock, soil, water, and food before becoming part of your body. After cremation, if those remains are buried, scattered, or eventually exposed to weathering, the mineral lattice will break down over time. Rainwater can dissolve portions of it. Wind can disperse it. Geological processes can incorporate it back into soil and sediment. Plants can absorb calcium from the ground. Animals can ingest it. The atoms that sat rigidly in your femur or jawbone may, centuries later, be part of a plant cell wall or another organism's skeleton. So even what stays in the urn does so temporarily. The urn is not a final state. It's a pause in redistribution. From a thermodynamic perspective, cremation removes the low-entropy organization of living tissue. What remains is the most stable inorganic component. But stability is relative. Given enough time, even crystalline mineral structures reintegrate into broader planetary cycles. And here's what's important psychologically. The urn contains atoms that were once arranged in your skeletal framework. It does not contain the pattern that made you who you were. The mineral residue is material continuity, not identity continuity. The overwhelming majority of your mass has already dispersed. What remains is the densest fraction temporarily held in one place, for a while. Because eventually, like everything else we've discussed, even that mineral scaffolding returns to circulation. The gases leave first. The minerals linger. But in the long arc of physics and geology, everything re-enters the cycle. the pattern ends. The atoms persist. And even what sits quietly in an urn is just matter waiting for its next rearrangement. This brings us to the uncomfortable but crucial distinction. If your atoms continue, do you continue? A lot of people want the answer to be yes. Physics and neuroscience suggest otherwise. A physicist named Richard Feynman used to point out something simple but profound. The atoms in your body are constantly being replaced. Through breathing, eating, drinking, sweating, you are in continuous exchange with your environment. Over the span of years, most of the atoms that were once part of you are swapped out, and yet your identity persists. Why? Because what remains relatively stable is not the atoms, it's the pattern, the arrangement, the dynamic structure of your nervous system, the connectivity of neurons, the organization of proteins, membranes, feedback loops, electrical gradients. You are less like a marble statue and more like a flame. In a flame, the individual molecules are constantly flowing in and out. The fuel changes. The gases move. Nothing in that flame is materially fixed, but the shape of the flame, its structure and behavior, remains recognizable for a while. Your body is the same. Atoms flow through you. The pattern holds. And that pattern, particularly in the brain, is what gives rise to memory, personality, perception, identity. It is a highly organized, low-entropy system maintained by continuous energy input. When cremation happens, or when death occurs by any means, that pattern collapses. Neurons stop firing. Membrane potentials dissipate. Synaptic connections lose structural integrity. The electrical and biochemical activity that encodes information ceases. And here's curious boss, information isn't relocated. It isn't transferred somewhere else in the atoms. It's erased as a coherent structure. The atoms persist. The organization does not. From a thermodynamic standpoint, a living brain is an extremely ordered configuration. It constantly fights entropy by consuming energy. When metabolism stops, entropy wins. The organized network that sustained consciousness degrades into simpler molecular arrangements. And no rearrangement of atoms elsewhere retains that original informational architecture. Think of a book. The story is not in the carbon atoms of the ink. It's not in the cellulose of the paper. It's in the specific arrangement of ink patterns on that paper. Burn the book, and the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in the paper and ink still exist. They become gas. They become ash. But the narrative is gone. You can't reconstruct the story from the smoke. Cremation is the same. The atoms remain. The narrative ends. And this is where clarity matters. When people say, but my atoms continue, they are correct. When they imply that continuity of atoms equals continuity of identity, they are not. Identity is a process. It's emergent. It depends on highly specific structural relationships within neural tissue. Remove the structure and the emergence stops. The flame goes out. The molecules continue drifting in the air. This isn't bleak. It's precise. It tells us what life actually is. A temporary, energy-dependent arrangement of matter capable of self-reflection. And it tells us what death is. The loss of that arrangement, not annihilation of matter, annihilation of pattern, which brings us back to the central idea. You are not your atoms. You are the specific configuration of